Ethan Brooks was 23 years old, with the kind of easy smile that made people trust him. He had grown up in a small Georgia town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where Friday night football games still drew half the county, and where his father's word carried weight like scripture. Ethan wasn't the type to chase trouble. He worked part-time at a local mechanic's shop, saved his money, and spent weekends fishing down by the river. People in town said Ethan was a good boy with a good heart. Then came Adrienne Cole. Adrienne had arrived 3 years earlier, renting a small apartment above the florist shop on Main Street. She was 25, graceful, with a quiet charm that turned heads without her even trying. She had a way of listening, really listening, that made people feel seen. Ethan noticed her one evening when she walked into the diner where he was eating with friends. She didn't seem to belong to the small town's rhythm, yet something about her made Ethan's world stop. They struck up a conversation, and before long, they were inseparable. Folks whispered about how fast the romance moved, but Ethan didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt alive, understood, cherished. Adrienne had a softness that balanced his rough edges. She laughed at his corny jokes, brought him coffee during his long shifts, and dreamed with him about a future that seemed wide open. By the end of that summer, Ethan knew this was the woman he wanted to marry. The night he proposed, he did it under the oak tree in his parents' backyard, the same spot where he'd played as a boy. Adrienne cried when she said yes, pressing her face into his shoulder, whispering, "You're my everything, Ethan." For Mary Brooks, Ethan's mother, the engagement was a moment of joy. She saw how Adrienne made her son glow. Mary hugged her soon-to-be daughter-in-law tightly and told her, "Welcome to the family." But Richard Brooks, Ethan's father, was different. Richard was 55, a retired Army sergeant who still carried himself like he was on parade. His face was weathered from years in the sun, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes, and his beliefs carved in stone. Around town, people respected Richard. He had discipline, conviction, and a sharp sense of right and wrong. But he also had a streak of stubborn pride, the kind that didn't bend, the kind that broke things instead. When Ethan told his father he was engaged, Richard's reaction was ice cold. "Dad," Ethan said over dinner one night, his eyes bright with excitement, "I asked Adrienne to marry me." Mary smiled, reaching for her son's hand. But Richard set down his fork slowly, staring at Ethan as if he hadn't heard right. "You're sure about this?" Richard asked, his tone flat. "Yes," Ethan replied, sitting up straighter. "I've never been more sure of anything." Richard's jaw tightened. "Son, marriage is forever. You don't just dive in because it feels good. You need to be certain she's who she says she is." Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Just that people put on masks. They hide things. You'd better know what you're getting into." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mary reached over quickly, touching Richard's arm. "Richard," she whispered, trying to defuse the moment. But Ethan had already stiffened. "I do know," Ethan said firmly. "Adrienne's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Richard didn't argue further, but the look on his face was enough. He didn't trust her. He didn't trust the woman his son loved. From that night on, there was a quiet tension in the Brooks household. Mary tried to smooth things over, talking to Richard in the evenings, urging him to give Adrienne a chance. "She makes Ethan happy," she said gently. "Isn't that what matters?" But Richard remained distant. He'd shake Adrienne's hand politely when she visited, but his eyes studied her with a soldier's suspicion. Adrienne, sensing the hostility, did her best to win him over, helping Mary in the kitchen, laughing at Richard's dry humor when he offered it. Yet deep down, she knew his approval wasn't coming. Still, Ethan didn't let it dampen his joy. He and Adrienne spent hours planning their wedding. They picked a small church outside town with whitewashed walls and stained glass windows. Adrienne wanted daisies in her bouquet. Ethan insisted on sunflowers because they'll match your smile. They laughed as they argued over cake flavors, teasing each other like two kids in love. To Ethan, it felt perfect. To Richard, it felt wrong. He couldn't explain why. Not yet, but something about Adrienne unsettled him. She was kind, respectful, even charming. But in Richard's eyes, there was always something she wasn't saying, something she was hiding. And Richard Brooks had spent a lifetime believing that secrets, no matter how carefully kept, always had a way of coming out. He just didn't know how destructive this secret would turn out to be. The engagement should have been a time of joy, but a shadow began to creep over Ethan and Adrienne's happiness. In a small town like theirs, whispers traveled faster than the wind. People liked to talk, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of cruelty. It started with a look, a comment overheard at the grocery store. An older woman leaned close to her friend and muttered, "There's something different about that girl. Can't quite put my finger on it." Adrienne heard it. She always heard it. She smiled politely, pretended she didn't notice, but inside her chest her heart tightened like a fist. She had lived with this fear for years, the fear that someone, someday, would see past the woman she had become and drag out the boy she once was. Her name had once been Andrew. That part of her life was supposed to be behind her, buried in another state, another identity. She had fought for herself, endured surgeries, therapy, and the painful journey to live authentically. Adrienne wasn't ashamed of who she was, but she was terrified of what the truth could cost her. Especially now. She loved Ethan with everything she had, and she knew if he discovered the truth, she might lose him forever. One evening, Adrienne confided in her closest friend, a coworker at the florist shop. They sat on the back steps, the smell of roses drifting through the summer air. "You can't keep this from him," her friend urged softly. "He deserves to know before the wedding." Tears welled in Adrienne's eyes. "And then what? He walks away? He looks at me like I'm a stranger? I can't risk it. I've never been this happy, and I can't lose him." Her friend squeezed her hand. "Secrets don't stay buried, Adrienne. Not forever." Those words rang true. And miles away, in the Brooks household, Richard was already feeding his suspicion. He noticed small things. The way Adrienne dodged certain questions about her past. The fact that no family ever came to visit her. The guarded look that flickered across her face when someone asked where she was from. To most, these were harmless gaps. To Richard, they were flashing red lights. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. Mary walked in and poured herself tea, watching her husband's rigid posture. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. "Doing what?" "Digging holes where there don't need to be any." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Something's off about that girl. I can feel it." Mary sighed, setting the cup down. "Richard, she's sweet. She loves Ethan. Isn't that what matters?" "It matters if she's lying," he shot back. "You don't hide your whole past unless you've got something worth hiding. Or unless it's painful," Mary countered. "Not everyone's life is a neat file folder you can open and read." But Richard wasn't convinced. The instincts that had carried him through war zones, that had taught him to trust no one, gnawed at him now. He couldn't shake the feeling that Adrienne was deceiving his son. And when Richard got an idea in his head, he didn't let go. The next week, he drove to the county clerk's office under the pretense of handling some paperwork. In truth, he was looking for anything he could find on Adrienne Cole. He searched through records, old files, anything that might reveal where she came from. At first, nothing. Then a detail caught his eye, a birth certificate that didn't quite match. The pieces were small, incomplete, but enough to deepen his obsession. That night, while Ethan was out with Adrienne, Richard sat alone in the living room, sifting through what he'd found. His fingers drummed against the table. "Who are you really, Adrienne?" he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Adrienne could feel the tension tightening around her. Ethan noticed her distraction. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, he touched her hand gently. "You've been quiet lately," he said. She forced a smile. "Just wedding stress." He tilted his head, studying her. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to pour out the truth and beg him to love her anyway. But fear pressed the words back down. "I know," she whispered, kissing his cheek. "And I love you." For a while, that answer was enough. But under the surface, the storm kept building. The town's whispers grew bolder. Someone claimed they'd seen Adrienne in Atlanta years ago, looking different. Another swore she'd once gone by another name. Ethan brushed it all off as gossip, but Richard collected every word like evidence in a case file. One Sunday after church, Richard pulled Ethan aside. "Son," he said sternly, "before you walk down that aisle, you'd better be sure. People are talking, and where there's smoke, there's fire." Ethan frowned. "People talk because they're bored, Dad. Adrienne is the best thing that's ever happened to me." Richard's gaze was like steel. Sometimes the best things turn out to be lies. Ethan shook his head, his voice sharp with frustration. "You don't know her like I do. You don't get to ruin this for me." He stormed off, leaving Richard standing alone in the church parking lot, jaw tight, fists clenched. Mary approached slowly, her voice trembling. "Please, Richard, don't destroy our family over this." But Richard's mind was already churning. He told himself he wasn't trying to destroy anything. He was trying to protect his son. And in his world, protection sometimes meant preemptive action. Richard Brooks had never been a man to let a question go unanswered. In the military, suspicion could mean the difference between life and death, and he carried that habit into civilian life. Once an idea lodged in his mind, he pursued it like a hunter chasing prey. And now his prey was the truth about Adrienne Cole. Weeks passed, and Richard's suspicion grew sharper. The town's whispers were fuel, but it was his own restless gut that drove him. He spent nights at the kitchen table, poring over scraps of information he'd collected. A misfiled record here, a curious absence there. It wasn't much, but to Richard, it spelled danger. One afternoon, Richard drove 2 counties over, far from anyone who might question why he was there. He visited an old friend from his army days, a man who now worked in law enforcement. Over beers in a dimly lit bar, Richard leaned in and said, "I need a favor." Quietly, his friend raised a brow. "What kind of favor?" "Background check. Name's Adrienne Cole. She's about to marry my son." The man hesitated. "You think she's trouble?" "I think she's hiding something," Richard said flatly. "And I won't rest until I know what." The friend sighed, but eventually agreed. A week later, a manila envelope arrived at Richard's doorstep. Inside were fragments of Adrienne's past, enough to set his blood boiling. There it was. The name Andrew Cole. Old medical records. Paperwork that told the story Adrienne had fought so hard to bury. Richard's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. To him, this wasn't just a secret. It was betrayal. It was an insult to his family, to his values, to everything he thought was right. That evening, Mary found him at the dining table, the envelope spread out before him. Her face paled as she read the words upside down. "Oh my God," she whispered. Richard's eyes burned with rage. She lied to him. Lied to all of us. And Ethan's too blind to see it. Mary sank into a chair, covering her mouth. "Richard, please, don't do anything rash. This doesn't change the fact that she loves our son. She's still the same person." Richard slammed his fist against the table, the papers scattering. "She is not the same. She is a fraud. And I'll be damned if I let my son walk down that aisle with her." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "If you love Ethan, don't destroy him. Let him choose." But Richard wasn't listening. In his mind, this wasn't about choice. It was about honor. About saving his son from what he saw as a life-shattering mistake. That night, Ethan came home from work to find his parents waiting. Richard sat rigid in his armchair, the envelope on his lap. Mary's face was pale, her hands twisting nervously. "Sit down, son," Richard said, his voice hard as stone. Ethan frowned but obeyed. "What's going on?" Richard threw the envelope onto the coffee table. "Read it." Ethan hesitated, then opened the file. His eyes skimmed the words, birth certificate, Andrew Cole, medical transitions, and his heart dropped into his stomach. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Ethan's face went pale. His hands shook as he clutched the papers. "This can't be right," he whispered. "This isn't." "It's the truth," Richard snapped. "The woman you think you love isn't who she says she is." Ethan's head spun. Adrienne's smile, her laughter, their dreams together, they all flashed before his eyes. He felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Mary reached out gently. "Ethan, listen, this doesn't erase who she is now. She loves you. That hasn't changed." But Richard's voice cut through like a blade. "It changes everything. She lied. She tricked you. And I won't let her drag this family into shame." Ethan slammed the papers down, his voice rising. "She didn't trick me. She's still Adrienne. She's still the woman I love. She's a man." Richard roared. "She's my fiancée." Ethan shot back, tears burning his eyes. "And if you can't see past that, then maybe you're the one living a lie." The room erupted in silence, the words echoing off the walls. Mary wept softly in the corner, torn between her husband and her son. Richard's chest heaved, his face red with fury. "You're not thinking straight. You're blinded. And I'll do what I have to do to protect you." Ethan's voice broke as he shouted. "Protect me from what? From happiness? From love? You're not protecting me. You're destroying me. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. Richard stood there, fists clenched, his breathing heavy. Mary stared at him with horror. "What have you done?" she whispered. Richard didn't answer. But in his heart, he believed he had no choice. He believed he was the only one willing to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. That night, Ethan drove to Adrienne's apartment. His eyes were still red, his voice unsteady, but when she opened the door, he pulled her into his arms. "Ethan," she whispered, her heart pounding. He held her tight, his voice trembling. I know everything. And I don't care. I just don't care." Her knees buckled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You still want me?" "I want you," he said firmly. "I love you. Nothing changes that." For a moment, hope flickered. They clung to each other as though the world wasn't falling apart around them. But both knew the truth. Richard Brooks wasn't done. His anger wasn't cooling. It was building, and it was about to ignite into something no one could stop. The summer heat lingered late into the evening, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavy. Ethan drove Adrienne back to his parents' house that night, determined to confront the storm head-on. He couldn't keep living in two separate worlds, one where he clung to the woman he loved, and another where his father's shadow loomed like a judge and executioner. When they pulled into the driveway, the lights inside the Brooks home glowed faintly. Adrienne hesitated, her hand trembling on the door handle. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Ethan reached over, squeezing her hand. "I won't hide you, Adrienne. Not anymore. He has to see who you really are. And he has to see how much I love you." They walked to the porch together, their fingers interlaced, but the air between them was tight with fear. Ethan opened the door, calling out, "Dad? Mom? We need to talk." Richard was already waiting in the living room, as if he had known they would come. He sat in his old recliner, the same one he'd occupied for years, but now he looked like a sentinel guarding sacred ground. On the table beside him, a glass of whiskey sat untouched. His eyes flicked from his son to Adrienne, cold and unyielding. Mary appeared from the kitchen, wringing a dish towel in her hands. Her face was drawn with worry, her eyes darting between them. She whispered, "Ethan, maybe tonight isn't the right time." But Richard cut her off. "It's as good a time as any." His voice was low, hard as steel. "Sit down." Ethan remained standing, pulling Adrienne closer to his side. "No, we're not here to be interrogated. We're here because you need to hear the truth from us, not from some papers you dug up." Richard's jaw tightened. "The truth is in black and white. You think you can stand here and tell me it's something else?" Adrienne swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Mr. Brooks, I never meant to deceive anyone. I'm not the person on those old documents anymore. I fought to be who I am today, and I love your son with all my heart. Please believe me." Richard rose slowly from his chair, his eyes burning. "You should have told him from the beginning. You let him fall for an illusion." Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp. "She's not an illusion. She's real. She's the most real person I've ever known." Richard's gaze hardened, flicking between them. "You've been poisoned, son. She tricked you, and now you're blind to it." Ethan's hands shook, but he didn't back down. "No. What I see is someone brave enough to live her truth, even when people like you tear her apart for it." The room was thick with tension, every breath ragged, every word a spark threatening to ignite. Mary's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please, stop this. All of you. This is tearing us apart." But the storm couldn't be stopped. Not now. Richard's hand slipped into his jacket pocket, and for the first time Adrienne noticed the shape of something heavy beneath the fabric. Her blood ran cold. "Dad." Ethan's voice dropped, trembling. "What are you doing?" Richard drew the pistol out slowly, his knuckles white around the grip. His voice was eerily calm. "Protecting my family." Adrienne gasped, stepping back instinctively, but Ethan threw himself in front of her. "No, this isn't the answer." Richard's eyes locked on Adrienne, and the years of discipline etched into his soldier's stance returned. His hands didn't shake. His voice carried the weight of a verdict. "You don't belong here. You never did." Adrienne's tears streamed down her face, her voice cracking. "I belong with him. That's all I've ever wanted. To love him. To be loved." For the briefest moment, Richard's eyes flickered, but the hardness returned. Ethan held up his hands, desperation pouring out of him. "Dad, listen to me. If you do this, you'll destroy everything. You'll destroy me." Mary cried out, rushing forward, but Richard barked, "Stay back, Mary." She froze, sobbing into her towel. The silence stretched, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing and Adrienne's muffled sobs. Then, with terrifying suddenness, the first shot rang out. The crack of the gun shattered the room. Adrienne screamed as Ethan shoved her sideways, but the bullet grazed her arm, drawing blood. "Stop!" Ethan roared, grappling with his father, trying to push the weapon down. But Richard was strong, fueled by fury and conviction. The gun went off again, and again, each shot louder than the last, echoing through the walls. Adrienne stumbled, collapsing to the floor as the bullets tore into her body. 7 shots in total, each one ripping apart the fragile hope she and Ethan had clung to. Her blood spread across the carpet, a red pool that seemed to swallow the room whole. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her in his arms, his hands slick with her blood. "Stay with me, baby, please don't go. Don't leave me." Her lips trembled, her eyes searching for his. She whispered something faint, almost lost in the chaos. "I love you." Then her body went still, her hand slipping from his. Ethan's scream tore through the house, raw and guttural, the kind of sound that came from a soul breaking. Mary collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, his chest heaving. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was no triumph in them, only emptiness. He had pulled the trigger, and now the weight of what he had done sank in like a stone, dragging him under. The neighbors had already heard the shots. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights filled the driveway, sirens wailing through the night. Officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun," one shouted. Richard didn't move at first. Ethan looked up, his face streaked with blood and tears, and screamed, "He killed her! He killed her!" Mary shrieked, pointing at her husband. "Take it from him before he kills us all." Finally, Richard lowered the pistol, his hand trembling as it slipped from his grip and clattered onto the floor. The officers rushed forward, shoving him to his knees, snapping cold metal cuffs around his wrists. As they hauled him up, Ethan lunged, screaming through his tears, "You murdered her! You murdered the only person who ever made me happy." Richard didn't resist. His face was blank, his shoulders sagging, but his voice, when it came, was hollow and chilling. "I did what had to be done." The officers dragged him out as Ethan collapsed back beside Adrienne's lifeless body, rocking her gently, whispering over and over, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Mary knelt beside her son, wrapping her arms around him as grief consumed them both. The house was filled with the smell of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, and the unbearable silence left in the wake of violence. By the time the coroner arrived, the town had already gathered outside, drawn by sirens and gossip. Neighbors stood in stunned silence, whispering as the stretcher rolled Adrienne's covered body out of the house. Some wept quietly, others shook their heads in disbelief. Inside the patrol car, Richard sat in handcuffs, staring out the window. The flashing lights painted his face in red and blue, but his expression was unreadable. He had convinced himself he was saving his son, but the reality was undeniable. He had destroyed him instead. And as Ethan pressed his forehead to Adrienne's still hand, the truth settled like ash in the air. Love had been silenced, not by fate, but by the cold hand of hatred. The house that once echoed with family dinners and Sunday morning laughter was now a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the porch, fluttering in the warm night air. Officers moved in and out with grim faces, snapping photos, collecting shell casings, cataloging every stain on the carpet where Adrienne had fallen. The quiet Georgia neighborhood was awake, neighbors crowding the sidewalks in hushed disbelief. Inside, Ethan sat slumped against the wall, his shirt soaked in blood that wasn't his own. His hands shook as he stared blankly at the floor. He could still feel Adrienne's last breath on his chest, still hear the faint whisper of, "I love you," leaving her lips before she went limp. His world had collapsed in a matter of seconds, and nothing would ever put it back together. Mary sat beside him, her arm draped around his shoulders, rocking slightly like she could comfort him back into the boy she once held as a baby. Her tears had run dry, but her face was carved with anguish. Every time she looked at the spot where Adrienne had lain, her stomach twisted with guilt. She had begged Richard to stop, begged him to see reason, but it hadn't been enough. An officer crouched beside Ethan. "Son, we need your statement. Can you talk to us?" Ethan looked up, his eyes red and hollow. "What else do you need?" "He killed her. My father killed her. I watched him do it." His voice broke, the last word cracking into a sob. Mary clutched his arm. "Don't make him relive it right now," she pleaded. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We'll give him time." Out in the driveway, Richard sat cuffed in the back of a patrol car. The red and blue lights strobed across his face, but he looked eerily calm. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't speak when an officer opened the door to ask if he understood his rights. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this outcome all along. Reporters had already begun to gather, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. "Mr. Brooks, why did you do it? Did you know she was transgender before tonight? Was this a hate crime?" The words sliced through the humid night, but Richard didn't flinch. He stared past them, stone-faced, a soldier in shackles. The following days were a blur of grief and chaos. News vans parked along the street. Headlines screamed across television screens and newspapers. "Georgia father shoots son's fiancée 7 times, and tragedy exposes small-town prejudice." The story spread far beyond the county line, igniting debates about love, identity, and violence. For Ethan, it was unbearable. He refused to leave Adrienne's apartment, surrounding himself with her things, the faint perfume on her pillow, the notes she'd scribbled and tucked into his lunchbox, the photo of them at the fair where her smile lit up the night sky. He played her voicemail over and over, clinging to the sound of her voice. Mary visited him daily, bringing food he barely touched. Sometimes she sat quietly with him. Other times she tried to coax him into sleeping, into eating, into living. But Ethan was a shell. The only words he repeated were, "She should still be here. We were supposed to get married." Meanwhile, Richard was charged with first-degree murder. His mugshot was splashed across every news station, his military service mentioned in every article. Some people in town defended him quietly, whispering that he had only acted out of shock, out of a misguided sense of protection. But many more condemned him, horrified by the brutality of what he'd done. The Brooks family name, once respected, was now a curse. Mary couldn't step into the grocery store without feeling eyes burning into her back. She heard the whispers, "That's the wife. That's the mother." She bore it silently, her heart breaking not just for her son and Adrienne, but for the man she had once believed was unshakable. The night before Adrienne's memorial, Ethan stood in the small church where they were supposed to marry. The pews were lined with flowers, the altar draped in white cloth. But instead of a wedding aisle, there was a framed photo of Adrienne surrounded by candles. Her smile seemed to shine even through the sorrow. Ethan placed a trembling hand on the frame. "We should have been standing here together tomorrow," he whispered. "You should have been walking toward me in your dress, not lying in the ground." His shoulders shook as he bent over, his tears falling onto the polished wood. During the service, the church was packed. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who had only heard her story came to pay their respects. The pastor spoke of compassion, of love that transcends, of the tragedy of lives cut short by hatred. But it was Ethan's eulogy that silenced the room. Standing at the pulpit, his voice raw, he said, "Adrienne was more than what people whispered about her. She was kind. She was brave. She was the person who made me believe in forever. My father thought he was protecting me, but he took away the one thing that made life worth living. And now I stand here broken, but still proud. Proud to have loved her, proud to have been hers, even if only for a little while." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Outside, the media swarmed, capturing every tear, every candle lit in Adrienne's memory. To them, it was a story. To Ethan, it was the burial of his heart. That night, alone in Adrienne's apartment, Ethan sat on the floor surrounded by the remnants of their life together. He clutched her sweater to his chest, rocking back and forth. His phone buzzed with calls he ignored, friends checking in, reporters digging for quotes, lawyers preparing for trial. None of it mattered. The only voice he wanted to hear would never answer again. And across town, in a cold jail cell, Richard lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, his certainty wavered. The echo of gunfire still rang in his ears. The look on his son's face burned into his memory. He had told himself he was saving Ethan. But the silence of the cell and the weight of the chains told another story. He had destroyed everything he claimed to protect. The town would never forget what happened inside the Brooks house that night. And neither would Ethan. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adrienne's face, felt her slipping away, and heard his father's voice declaring, "I did what had to be done." It was a sentence that would haunt him forever. The courthouse in downtown Macon had seen its share of sensational trials, but nothing in recent memory had shaken the town like State of Georgia versus Richard Brooks. The steps were swarmed each morning with reporters holding microphones, cameras flashing, voices barking questions over one another. To them, it was more than a murder case. It was a cultural battle, a story that touched nerves far beyond one family's tragedy. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The pew-like benches were filled with townspeople, some who had known the Brooks family for years, others who had come only to witness the drama. On one side sat Mary, her face pale, her hands clenched together as though in prayer. On the other sat Ethan, his shoulders stiff, his eyes focused forward with a cold determination. Between them sat a gulf of silence that had once been a family bond. Richard entered each day in a gray suit provided by his defense attorney, his wrists no longer in cuffs, but his steps heavy, as though each footfall carried the weight of the crime he refused to admit. He stood straight, his military posture unbroken, but the lines on his face seemed deeper, his eyes darker. He refused to look at his son. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. In opening statements, the district attorney, a sharp woman named Carla Jennings, stood before the jury and said, "This was not an accident. This was not a moment of confusion. This was an execution." Richard Brooks fired 7 shots at an unarmed young woman who posed no threat to him. And he did it because of prejudice, because he could not accept that his son's fiancée was transgender. That is not protection. That is not love. That is murder. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Richard sat motionless, staring at the floor, while his attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer named Alan Parker, rose to respond. "This case is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe," Parker began. "This was not an execution. This was a father blindsided by a secret, a man raised with values that did not prepare him for such a revelation. He acted in a moment of shock, of emotional turmoil, not with cold calculation. Richard Brooks is not a monster. He is a man who made a tragic mistake." The trial moved forward, day by day, testimony after testimony painting a picture of that fateful night. Neighbors described hearing the gunshots, hearing Ethan's screams. Officers recounted arriving at the scene, finding Richard standing with the weapon still in his hand. Forensic experts spoke of the trajectory of the bullets, each one deliberate, each one aimed at Adrienne. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ethan took the stand. The courtroom hushed as he walked to the witness chair. His hair was unkempt, his face drawn from sleepless nights, but his voice carried a strength born of heartbreak. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, his eyes briefly flicking toward his father before settling firmly on the prosecutor. "Ethan," Jennings began gently, "can you tell us what happened on the night of July 18th? He swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the chair. "We went to my parents' house because I wanted my dad to understand. I wanted him to see that I loved Adrienne, no matter what. We walked in together, hand in hand. My mom was there, crying already. My dad was waiting. He had the gun. He said he was protecting me. But he wasn't protecting me. He was destroying me." Jennings nodded, her voice soft. "And what happened next?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "He shot her. He pulled the trigger again and again while I tried to stop him. I held her while she died. She told me she loved me, and then she was gone." His voice cracked, a sob escaping before he steadied himself. "He didn't just kill her. He killed our future. He killed the only person who ever made me feel whole." A hush fell over the room. Even jurors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glassy with emotion. Mary buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. Richard sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge his son's words. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, the tension thickened. "Ethan," Parker said carefully, "you testified that your father said he was protecting you. Isn't it possible that he acted out of fear for your well-being, not out of malice?" Ethan's eyes snapped toward him, blazing. "Protect me from what? From being happy? From loving someone who made me better? That wasn't protection. That was hate. The answer cut through the air like a blade. Parker hesitated, shuffled his papers, and moved on, but the damage was done. Over the next days, the trial continued. Character witnesses spoke of Richard's military service, his devotion to discipline, his reputation as a man of principle. The defense painted him as someone who lost control in a moment of emotional shock. But the prosecution hammered away, 7 bullets, each one a choice. Finally, it was time for Richard to testify. The courtroom held its breath as he took the stand, his face grim, his voice steady. "I never wanted to hurt my son," he said. "Everything I've ever done was to protect him. But when I found out the truth, I lost myself. I thought I was saving him from a lifetime of shame. I didn't see it as murder. I saw it as doing what had to be done." Jennings stepped forward, her eyes locked on him. "Mr. Brooks, do you hear yourself? 7 bullets. Into a woman unarmed, begging for her life. Into your son's fiancée. That is not protection. That is not losing control. That is murder." Richard's jaw tightened. He said nothing more. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, his voice clear. "We find the defendant, Richard Brooks, guilty of first-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mary sobbed openly. Ethan closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, not from victory, but from the hollow confirmation that his father's actions could never be undone. The judge, her voice firm but solemn, pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Richard didn't flinch. He nodded once, as though he had expected nothing less. As he was led away in chains, Ethan finally looked at him. Their eyes met across the courtroom, father and son, bound forever by blood, but severed forever by violence. In that silent exchange, Ethan saw no remorse, only a stubborn pride that twisted his stomach. He turned away, whispering to himself, "You took everything, and now you'll have nothing." Outside, the courthouse steps erupted with cameras, microphones, and headlines. But for Ethan, the noise didn't matter. He walked past them all, his heart still back in that church where he had buried the woman he loved. The trial had given him justice, but not peace. And as the doors closed on Richard Brooks's freedom, the weight of the verdict did little to lighten the grief that would follow Ethan for the rest of his life. The trial was over, but the echoes of it lingered everywhere. For weeks, the courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding candles, activists holding signs, and reporters hungry for one last quote. But when the cameras left, when the headlines shifted to other tragedies, the Brooks family was left to live in the silence of what had been lost. Ethan returned to Adrienne's apartment one final time. The lease was ending, and he needed to pack her belongings. He walked through the small space slowly, his hand brushing over the counter where she used to brew morning coffee, the window where she'd waved to him as he left for work. Each object was a ghost: her perfume on the nightstand, the half-finished book by her bed, the list of wedding tasks pinned to the fridge. He sank onto the couch, clutching her sweater against his face. Closing his eyes, he could almost hear her humming softly in the kitchen, almost feel her hand resting gently on his shoulder. But when he opened his eyes, he was alone. Mary came by to help, her arms heavy with boxes. She paused at the doorway, watching her son crumble under the weight of memory. Quietly, she set the boxes down and sat beside him. "I don't know how to move on," Ethan whispered. Her eyes glistened. "Neither do I. But we have to try. For her." He shook his head. She deserved a life, a wedding, a family, and he took all of it away. His voice cracked. "Sometimes I wish it had been me instead." Mary's breath caught, and she grabbed his hand. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. You're all I have left." They sat in silence, broken only by the sound of their tears. The community struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Some rallied to honor Adrienne's memory, organizing vigils and raising money in her name to support LGBTQ youth. Others muttered their judgments behind closed doors, unwilling to let go of the same prejudices that had fueled Richard's rage. The town was divided, but Adrienne's story spread far beyond it. Her face appeared in national news segments, her name attached to conversations about intolerance, violence, and love denied. For Ethan, every mention was a double-edged sword. He wanted her remembered, wanted the world to know who she was, but he hated that her legacy was tied to the violence of her death. She had been more than a victim. She had been laughter and late-night talks, gentle kisses and quiet dreams. She had been his future. Months passed, but the wound never closed. Ethan visited her grave often, bringing sunflowers because they had been his choice for their wedding. He knelt in the grass, tracing the letters of her name carved into stone. "I should have protected you," he whispered one afternoon, his voice breaking. "I should have done more. I'm so sorry." Sometimes, he sat there for hours, speaking to her as though she could still hear him, telling her about the things he saw, the emptiness he felt, the memories that both kept him alive and tore him apart. Mary joined him occasionally, standing quietly a few steps back, letting her son have his moments. She had her own grief to bear, grief for Adrienne, grief for Ethan, and grief for the man she had once loved. Richard was still alive, but in every way that mattered, he was gone. In prison, Richard remained unrepentant. Letters from Mary went unanswered. When Ethan visited once, more out of compulsion than desire, the encounter ended in silence. They sat across from each other, separated by a scratched plastic divider. "I just want to know why," Ethan said finally. His voice trembled with anger and despair. "Why couldn't you just let me love her?" Richard's eyes were tired but unyielding. "Because it wasn't right." Ethan pressed his forehead against the divider, tears spilling down his cheeks. "You don't get to decide what's right. You don't get to destroy someone because you don't understand them." Richard said nothing. He only sat back, his hands folded, his face blank. Ethan never went back. By the one-year anniversary of Adrienne's death, Ethan had changed. He was thinner, his face older somehow, but his eyes carried a quiet strength. At a candlelight vigil held in her memory, he stood before a crowd gathered in the town square. Hundreds of small flames flickered in the night. "She was taken from me because of hate," he said, his voice steady. "But hate doesn't get to write the last word. Love does. Adrienne taught me what it means to love without fear, without conditions. That's how I'll remember her. That's how I'll live for her." The crowd bowed their heads, candles raised high. For a moment, the town that had been divided was united in sorrow and hope. After the vigil, Ethan walked home alone. The night air was cool, the stars scattered across the sky. He looked up, whispering softly, "I hope you can see this, Adrienne. I hope you know I'll never stop loving you." Life moved forward, though never the same. Ethan began speaking at schools and community centers, sharing Adrienne's story. He wanted people to understand that love should never be a reason for violence, that secrets didn't have to end in tragedy if people chose compassion over judgment. It was his way of keeping her alive. Mary supported him, though her own nights were long and sleepless. Sometimes, she still reached for Richard in the dark, forgetting for a fleeting second that he was gone, that the man she had once trusted was now a stranger behind bars. The weight of that betrayal never lifted, but she clung to her son, determined not to lose him too. As for Richard, he faded into obscurity. Another inmate in a system full of men who believed their choices were justified. The world moved on without him, his name remembered only in connection with the blood he spilled. Ethan carried the memory differently. To him, Adrienne wasn't defined by the way she died, but by the way she lived. She had loved fiercely, honestly, bravely. And though her life had been cut short, the mark she left on his heart would never fade. In the end, the Brooks family story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when fear overrides love, when prejudice outweighs humanity. But for Ethan, it was more than a lesson. It was his life, his grief, his everlasting promise to the woman he would always call his fiancée. He stood at her grave one final time that year, placing a single sunflower against the headstone. The sun dipped low, casting the cemetery in golden light. "I'll carry you with me," he whispered, his voice steady now. "Everywhere I go, every day I live. You'll always be mine." The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves as if to answer. Ethan closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and walked away, not free from the pain, but stronger for having loved through it. And so the story closed, not with justice alone, not with punishment, but with a broken heart refusing to let hate have the final word.